Good afternoon, good morning, colleagues. Thank you very much for joining us on the first of our methodological learning series from the Evaluation Office. I'm Uyen, and I take the pleasure today to introduce both of our panelists. We have Paul Jasper and Steffen Eckhard, both who will be presenting briefly on their work in natural language processing as it applies to sort of producing evaluative and generating evaluative evidence. This is an area that, as all of you know, we're quite interested and keen on exploring. And I think there's a lot of promise to this. We are using it sort of in various country contexts, but having sort of proper guidance and prepared resources for our colleagues who really want to go deeper into this area of work is one of the main objectives. This webinar will just be to sort of give people an idea, flavor, and description of how this can be applied. And then there'll be follow-up resources for people who would like to learn more. Let me just introduce Paul Jasper, who will be our first panelist. He's an economist. He has extensive experience in data analytics and data management, quantitative research, experimental and quasi-experimental evaluation methods, and statistical analysis. He leads the data innovation team at the Oxford Policy Management Group, where he works on modern data science methods applications in policymaking and innovative methodological approaches to quantitative studies. His work includes assessing the usefulness of big data and AI approaches for poverty measurement and advising the Canadian government on text analytics and machine learning to improve program evaluations. So he's been working on several COVID-related projects, most recently in the Mozambican government, and published a lot on how to map nutritional indicators geospatially, which is very interesting. We usually measure nutrition in very non-geospatial ways, so that would be interesting to look at. Using remote sensing data, additionally, he also he's the head of statistics at Groot, a technology startup based in Berlin that offers an innovative solution to data collection in remote communities. This is just the kind of stuff that we would love to pick his brain on. So I won't say anything further. I'll hand it over to Paul to present his work. Over to you, Paul.
Great. Thank you very much, Uyen. Thanks, everyone. Let me begin by sharing my screen briefly. This worked earlier, so I hope that it's working. Can you see my screen? Could you just confirm quickly?
Yes.
Great. Okay, perfect. Okay, hello, everyone. Yeah, thank you very much for having me and for inviting me to this session. As Uyen explained, I'm going to spend about 20 minutes touching on 3 examples of natural language processing or text analytics in the context of evaluations that we have implemented at Oxford Policy Management. So I'm going to start just briefly by discussing how this fits into our general data innovation work at OPM. And then I'm going to explain the 3 examples, and I'm going to try to wrap this up with a brief conclusion around where we see challenges and opportunities of using NLP in the context of evaluations. Some of these you will have seen then in the examples that I'm going to be giving. So just very briefly, in terms of data innovations, OPM has been starting to talk and think about data innovation for a while, but one important sort of publication that came up recently, right, is the World Development Report from 2021, where there's this great quote that I always bring up about when I have these kind of, it reads, the innovations resulting from the creative new uses of data could prove to be one of the most life-changing events of this era for everyone. Obviously, that's a pretty grand statement. It's great in talks like this where we discuss data innovation and new techniques. This everyone, from my perspective, from our perspective, also includes evaluators. And that means that we need to engage with these methods and need to engage with these creative new uses of data. And hence, we have a data innovation team at OPM that thinks about how to do that. And just very briefly, what do we mean by data innovation? We really mean by that anything that relates to approaches that use new data, and new data we define as anything that's not traditional survey or census data. OPM has done a lot of work in sort of collecting, analyzing survey and census data. new data sets are coming in, mainly because a lot more on human activities is digital by now. And that includes also things like social media data and large sets of electronically recorded text data. So data innovation is that on the one hand. On the other hand, we think about, we consider data innovation to encompass also new methods, and new methods are the methods that you use in a way to analyze these large sets of new data. Machine learning, natural language processing. So I've highlighted that here because that's the topic today, but also other new analytical techniques. That's what we think of as data innovation. And that's what our data innovation team works on. Text data and natural language processing, in our experience, at least over the last, let's say, 5 years or so, has become an increasingly relevant component of our work. More and more clients talk about it. There are more and more sort of exploratory projects also where this is being used, or where the benefits, challenges are being explored. And what we consider NLP here very loosely is, as any sort of method, electronic method, analysis method that can be employed to process human language using computers, really. And that is actually important, the fact that it's so loose, because we will see in some of the examples later on that in some of the evaluations or in some of the projects that we have worked on, NLP's benefit really and opportunities don't necessarily come from the sort of machine learning or AI part of the natural language processing, so where it's about extracting insights from text in an automatic way, but also from the fact that it's just a great way to get structure into unstructured data, right? So to sort of process text data in an automated way that can then help to get a human to gain insights from this data in a better way, right? So natural language processing, therefore, it's quite defined as quite broadly, and in our projects we deal with this, but also with the more sort of machine learning or perhaps exciting part of natural language processing. So let me go into a couple of examples now of what we've done at OPM and why I think these points that I just mentioned are important. The first example is something that we mentioned briefly. Is a project that is not that we now. This is now a few years back that we implemented for Global Affairs Canada. Global Affairs Canada, the Canadian government, they came to us with a challenge and with advice on how we think, or we thought that natural language processing could be applied in their procedures to implement program evaluations. So Global Affairs Canada program evaluations are large, complex, and expensive. So why is that the case? What these program evaluations refer to are sort of evaluations that come after about a decade of funding in a certain program, for example, on maternal and child health, with large sets of funding that goes to many different projects. The way that these program evaluations at the end of such a funding period work is that basically humans review project documentation, right? So imagine 900 projects, 10 years of funding, all of the sort of evaluative documents, project reports, etc. From that, they get stored somewhere and then they get analyzed by humans. And the way that works is that if you think about it, this is the project life very simplified. There's a start with a proposal, there's an implementation. And out of this, we have all these texts that come from this. So for example, project proposals, right? Progress reports, project end reports. They all get sent to someone at Global Affairs Canada. They get stored somewhere. And in fact, a lot of it gets stored in this unstructured corpus of documents. I mean, basically dumped into a big bucket, right? There's no table behind that extracts labels or anything like that from these documents. And then we come to the program evaluation phase. A consultant or a team of consultants starts to go through that, right? They need to think about, okay, they can't read everything. So they need to think about which projects do they look at, which documents do they look at, how do they review these documents, and then they need to extract insight and report on this, right? So it's a big effort. It costs a lot. It takes a long time. And so the question was, okay, where can NLP be used to kind of improve this, right? And so this was a purely a sort of consultative exercise. So we looked at this and gave some recommendations about where NLP could help. And so what we discussed were a couple of different things, and I think the main, I mean, there were more points to discuss in here, but the main sort of issues or main benefits of where NLP might help were the following. So one is, I mean, basically to make the overarching idea basically is to make sense of this large unstructured corpus of documents, right? So what does that mean? It means, for example, in the project selection phase, right? So one of the things that that the consultants that do these program evaluations or program reviews don't necessarily know is what all these projects exactly are about, or whether certain projects touch certain topics, right? So if the overall program was on maternal and child health, some of them might be on child nutrition, others might be on antenatal care, others might be on other issues related to that, you know, because a lot of different topics obviously intersect in this sort of large topic area. So in order to actually label documents or projects and project reports by certain topics, natural language processing could help by do some automated topic modeling, label documents, sift through them, sort them, and help then the reviewers to select the right projects in a faster, easier way than what they would have to do otherwise, which is really reviewing large sets of documentation. Another example of what could be done is document selection, right, which is similar, but with different methods, with information retrieval methods. So in a sense, this is almost like programming like a good search function over this unstructured corpus of documents. So developing an algorithm that helps reviewers to search these documents in an efficient way, not just looking for words, but looking for associations of words as well, and therefore going beyond just a simple sort of keyword searching function. And then another example of what we thought about was what we discussed was coding of documents. So one step in this data analysis procedure that human reviewers normally would do would be something like in vivo coding, right? And so reading through documents, coding specific parts depending on sort of specific topics or issue areas that they might be interested in, and then after that doing a subsequent analysis of that. Natural language processing can also help to do that in an automated way. Again, this could be related to topic modeling, could be related to sentiment analysis. Specific parts in documents could be labeled as specific, as relating to very positive, very negative sentiments, and that could then help, again, the humans at the end to do these reviews in a faster way. So the whole point of this project was really to look through the procedure that Global Affairs Canada goes through in order to do these program reviews, and then identify some places where we think that NLP could be implemented in order to improve these procedures or implement them in a cheaper or perhaps faster way. That's one example. And as I said before, this is, from my perspective, one example where NLP really, where the benefit of using NLP really comes from the fact that it can help you to make sense of for large sets of unstructured text. At the end of this whole process, there might still be, and there's very likely still a human that needs to do an analytical task, looking at, for example, specific documents that have been tagged with specific topics, or looking at specific documents or specific projects. But the point is that all of that is much more, it's easier and more efficient to do because you have a pre-processed set of text that NLP helps you to sift through. So that was the example of Global Affairs Canada. Let me briefly explain or show two more projects that OPM has implemented and where we have used NLP. So this Global Affairs Canada project was more advisory, and then we went into actually implementing some NLP analysis in two other evaluations. So one was the real-time assessment of UNICEF's COVID-19 response in Europe and Central Asia. So just to quickly say that what we tried to assess there was UNICEF's response to the pandemic. There were different questions that we looked at, different sort of topic areas that we wanted to analyze. And the evaluation, the core component of this evaluation really related to document review, but also to key informant interviews, right? So this is the NLP component of this evaluation was not the main component. Natural language processing, in particular, social media listening was just one component to the overall evaluation. So what we did was, in this RTA, we had round 1 and round 2. In round 1, we implemented a static analysis, NLP analysis of UNICEF documentation. So something that sort of enriched the analysis that our consultants did by reviewing documents. But the more interesting part from our perspective was in round 2, where we decided to look at more recent social media conversations in a selected set of countries on a selected set of topics. We looked at education and social protection. And the way that we did with this was that we used UNICEF's in-house social media listening tool, which is TalkWalker, right? So we gained access to TalkWalker, and we used TalkWalker to download historical data over a certain period of time on specific topics. We pre-processed that data, this social media data, and ran analysis in R. The approach was exploratory in nature. We deployed social media listening in this sense for the first time actually at OPM in the context of an evaluation. And the objectives were really to understand which topics people talked about when in the context of COVID-19, and UNICEF's response, what topics did people talk about, what mattered in conversations online, and could we link them to specific sort of trends and areas of interest in particular for the evaluation? How did these topics vary over time? Did UNICEF actually matter in these conversations? And another objective was to understand in how far this analysis could shed light on UNICEF's COVID-19 response in Europe and in the Europe and Central Asia region. So we ran a couple of different queries that gave us different amounts of results from social media on these topics. And the main thing that I would like to emphasize is are two things. One first sort of large set of analysis that we did was on education. So we ran a query on TalkWalker that gave us data on social media conversations related to COVID-19 and education from these countries. Okay, and we analyzed that data. The main findings from this analysis were the following. So one is we saw that perhaps unsurprisingly in this context, because Turkey is the biggest economy, data from Turkey and in particular data from Twitter absolutely dominated the conversation. That's partly also related to the fact that Twitter data is easier to access than other data actually on social media conversations. Social media conversations that were explicitly linked to UNICEF and COVID-19 unsurprisingly expanded. They increased in importance between 2020 and 2021. And we observed in the data spikes, we could link them to waves of new cases or deaths in Turkey. This really dominated the conversation. The topic area of COVID-19 and education clearly mattered. So this conversation also expanded and it increased in importance during these times. What we then did is some additional topic modeling, related to these social media data that we got in order to understand whether specific issues in these conversations could be identified as being important. And so in some countries, we could identify that, we saw that these topics reflected national sort of interests, if you want to, right? So in Azerbaijan, as you can see here on the right-hand side, one of the topics, topic 1, which we identified, which when we looked at the words associated with these topics were related to military conversations, conversations about military, they clearly reflected some national idiosyncrasies, right? So related to the military conflict in Azerbaijan, for example. And the topic modeling also observed some trends. So, for example, an increasing concern for training and support to teachers and female students actually over time. Overall, though, we saw that UNICEF did not feature that significantly in conversations related to education and COVID-19 in general. So we looked for both for a conversation that focused on UNICEF particularly and a conversation in general related to education and COVID-19. And we saw that UNICEF in that conversation didn't feature very significantly. So this is when we looked at education sort of topic area and looked at these countries. We ran a second analysis related to social protection and social media discussions in Albania and Tajikistan. In both countries, social protection and COVID-19 related conversations spiked significantly after the first cases of COVID-19 appeared. The volume of conversations, though, was much smaller in Tajikistan. So this really mattered. Again, social protection, the conversation around that really, expanded after the first cases of COVID-19. In Albania, we could identify that some key topics in this conversation related to news and updates on health and social protection, also humanitarian and social support to the poor, and the situation in Kosovo. And these topics were discussed throughout. However, what we could identify is that there was focus, there was a shift in the focus of these conversations. So what that meant is that some key terms in the topics and the importance of them actually moved over time. So we saw that the role of government in health and social protection was discussed less over time, and that shifted more to a general discussion of updates on COVID-19, and also provision of integrated services by municipalities, which was clearly visible at the beginning, was discussed less over time, shifting to the needs of particularly vulnerable individuals. So in a way, what we think we saw is a shift in terms of what mattered for social media conversations in Albania, over the period that we looked at. In Tajikistan, we saw that topics of humanitarian and social assistance increased in importance. We saw topics of assistance, aid, help, and support, and that they were discussed more frequently over time. And actually, in Tajikistan, UNICEF in that conversation featured more prominently compared to Albania. And then also what we saw is that the situation in Afghanistan played an increasingly important role over time. In Tajikistan, obviously, Afghanistan being a country that Afghanistan being a neighbor to Tajikistan. So those were sort of some of the trends and topics that we could see when we looked at social media data, both in relation to education and social protection. But at the end of this, and I'm just going to summarize that very briefly because I'm going to have an overall conclusion at the end as well. At the end of this exploratory exercise, we had a few key lessons that we think are important. So one is, the role of social media listening in the context of such an evaluation still needs to be better defined from the beginning. Our exercise was quite exploratory. And now the next step is to think about, okay, what does that actually mean? And where do the actual benefits or the insights lie? And how can they be sort of built into an evaluation design from the beginning? Social media listening can help us to understand what's being discussed online, and also what matters to people. It also provided some insight on the relevance of UNICEF for these discussions, but the insights are limited when it comes to answering questions around relevance or effectiveness of UNICEF activities, right? And that really is what matters for an evaluation or an RTA, right? So we thought that from this work in general, an insight could be that social media listening could provide greatest value in the formative or design phases of an evaluation. So begin at the beginning, before designing an evaluation, or while designing an evaluation, before then going into the field to conduct interviews and hone into specific topics. And we think that's because social media listening can help you to identify what people talk about, what they care about, and how these things developed over time, right? So what we had in mind is doing some social media listening at the beginning to inform sort of the definition of evaluation questions and the discussions, for example, that you would then have in key informant interviews and such. So that's just on social media listening in this RTA. I know that I'm sort of almost at the end of my time, so I'm going to very quickly present the last example, which is exploring the use of natural language processing in a qualitative evaluation, more precisely analyzing key informant interviews. So this is very recent. What we did is we looked at a quite small set of key informant interviews that have been transcribed. So we analyzed a set of 24 key informant interviews, and the idea was to understand whether NLP could be used in such a context, right? Which is not that uncommon. Like if you do a qualitative evaluation, many of our qualitative evaluations have limited number of interviews, of key informant interviews, right? And so the question is, can we do something with NLP that can either help us to generate additional findings, or can we validate some previous findings, right? From the work that our qualitative analysts or colleagues do on these key informant interviews. So we looked at that, and we did some descriptive analysis, which involves things like simple, what words come up as very frequently, We did some topic modeling in order to identify what topics did people talk about in these key informant interviews, some sentiment analysis to understand, okay, were people talking about certain topics in a positive or negative way. We also did some document positioning, so trying to extract insights from documents in terms of whether they are very similar to each other or not, whether specific clusters of documents appear and what that actually tells us about what people say. And I mean, the results, unfortunately, were not overly convincing. So, and that's basically because we could extract features from the text, yeah, without reading it, of course, that revealed relevant patterns in the data. So what I mean is we really separated the teams, our qualitative research team and then the NLP people. The NLP people didn't know anything about what was going on in these documents, right? But just by doing this NLP analysis, for example, we could see that there were some interviews that were clearly about something related to to markets, suppliers, manufacturing. So there was a topic appearing in a cluster of documents, and we could assign a sentiment to that. So we could say, oh, these documents are about markets and supplies, and people are talking relatively positively to that compared to another issue area related to gender, for example, right? So we could identify certain topics appearing in these key informant interviews. We could also say something about the fact that they were positive or negatively viewed. However, in the context of a qualitative evaluation like this, where the number of interviews is manageable almost, you know, much of this was already known. So when we came to our colleagues, we were like, yeah, okay, this is interesting, but we kind of know this already. So the question is, okay, how do we extract? I mean, that's obviously nice from a validation perspective, but the question is to extract interesting and additional insights for the evaluation. What would we need to do, right? And one of the insights from our perspective from this very simple work is that, similar to the SML work, that one should have thought about the NLP component of an evaluation, obviously, from the very beginning. So what that means is that some of the number of informant interviews, but also the structure of the key informant interviews could have been designed in a way that's then easier or more interesting for NLP analysis to be implemented. And we can talk about that in the Q&A, perhaps, if people are interested to hear about ideas we haven't sort of progressed with further. But we have seen in the literature that you know, this similar sort of approaches, obviously on larger sets of documents where, and then we come back to the examples that I mentioned before, where it would be prohibitively expensive for individuals to read through all of them, of course, can yield very interesting and different results. So this is the third example I just quickly wanted to mention. And I mean, I'm not going to spend much time on this. I just quickly wanted to say that from this work so far at OPM, we think that there are a couple of very clear opportunities with NLP. So in context where our clients face, or organizations that we work with face, large sets of unstructured text data that they need to kind of sift through and understand, NLP can really generate a lot of value and interesting insights, right? And we think that, in fact, this could be done at the very beginning of a larger evaluative effort, and it could help to design and to guide also later steps in an evaluation. There are some clear challenges, though, for what we want to do in an evaluation. If we want to answer questions around relevance, around effectiveness, and things like that, generating insights with NLP about sort of these specific concepts from text is difficult, yeah? And so NLP might yield more limited sort of evaluative insights there. And this is where the combination of using NLP to get structure around data and then human evaluators to actually sort of make sense of that then might be particularly beneficial. That was my presentation. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to take some questions now. Sorry, I realized that I talked a little bit longer than the assigned 20 minutes. Sorry for that.
That's okay, Paul. Why don't we do this? I'm going to move on to Steffen and his presentation, and then we'll sort of collect the questions. But I see a lot of very relevant stuff in what you have said, especially for evaluators on the line now who are thinking about how to plan their next evaluation and potentially using this in their formative sort of inception phase. Our next panelist is Steffen Eckhard. He is a professor of public policy and public administration at the Zeppelin University, Friedrichshafen. How was that? Germany. His research and teaching focus on is on management of international and domestic public organizations and their impact on politics and society. So in support of his research, his team have developed a range of novel text as data applications. Steffen is also the author of The Politics of Evaluation in International Organizations, which will be forthcoming from the Oxford University Press next year. He also serves as an advisor to the German Ministry of the Interior and several international organizations, including WFP, UNHCR, and UNDPO. Thank you very much. And Steffen, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ian, for having me here. Dear colleagues, I hope you're all well and you can see my slides. Is that the case? Ian, can you give me a sign, please? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Great. So thanks, Ian, for the kind introduction. And Paul, it was a pleasure listening to your applications as well. Some of the things I'm going to say will connect to that. So I'm a professor of public administration, public policy at Zeppelin University, which is in the south of Germany in Friedrichshafen. So that was excellent, Ian. If you haven't heard of the university before, you have heard maybe of the city's greatest invention, which is obviously Zeppelin. So I hope I can, it's a place of innovation. I hope I can also tell you something new with this presentation today. And I wanted to set us off with an overview of text analytical methods. So that's from a textbook, the first, I think, or the most influential textbook on natural language processing in social sciences. By Grimmer and Stewart, and in their book, they came up with this tree graph, basically showing off the various methods that, in principle, exist in the natural language processing technique. And I'm not going to go through all of that, but I wanted to, make you aware of the fact that most of the natural language processing activities is essentially about classifications, classifying the documents. Paul spoke about the massive amount of text that we have, so it's about classifying the text. And there are two principal ways how you can think about it. Either you know what you're looking for, then the categories that you're classifying are known, or you don't know what you're looking for, then the categories are unknown. So this is, if you look here to the left side of the branches, the two different ways of, or fundamentally different methods that we have in natural language processing, analytical methods. And so I'm going to introduce three of them. Three seems to be the magic number today. Paul had three, I will have three as well. So three applications. Two of them are from a more academic background, and I'll quickly introduce our interest. So it's not necessarily an evaluative interest, but it is linked to that. And one of them is from an evaluation of the peace-building policy implementation of the World Food Programme. So there is maybe really a nice link to some of the evaluative purposes that you and your colleagues might also have here. So let's begin with the supervised methods. In that case, the application, and by the way, supervised method means quite often we're talking about machine learning techniques. So this is usually what we mean with a supervised method. In that case, my colleagues and myself, we were interested to extract quantitative performance information from text-based evaluation reports. So every organization in the UN system have hundreds, thousands of these evaluation reports. Quite often they don't have a performance metric, so like a school grade expressing the performance. I think UNICEF has this, I'm not quite sure, but most of the other organizations, UN organizations, don't have that. So it's very difficult to extract information from these reports and also say something about, how well an evaluated activity was carried out, how well it performed. And we wanted to extract this quantitative performance metrics from the reports. So what we basically did after reading in the reports, we had 1,000 evaluation reports in that case, is that we split up the text, and we processed the text and split it up at the level of sentences. 1,000 reports is roughly 1 million sentences. And then we categorized, here's the categorization aspect, or we classified sentences as containing a positive statement about the evaluated activity, a negative statement about the evaluated activity, or neutral and descriptive text about the background, right? So the assumption is here, obviously, the more positive assessment sentences in a report, the more positive also the overall evaluated activity. What we did to train or to enable us to classify is that we hand-coded sentences. We basically took 100 reports and classified 10,000 individual sentences. And then we used these sentences to train a pre-existing language model. So these language models, they are provided by Google or Amazon, and you can train them with your own data for any kind of classification purpose that you could think of. So we trained them on these sentences. And here's an example for a positive sentence that says the effective management and efficient allocation and use of resources have contributed to the achievement of results grounded in EU normative standards from a UN Women evaluation. A negative sentence is this one here. However, the lack of an institutional host or anchor for the awareness-raising campaign strategy casts some doubt with regards to the sustainability. Right, you get it. Some of these sentences clearly are critical, some are more positive. And then there is a lot of more descriptive information about the methods, about the background of the information. Roughly half of the text is descriptive. And we calculated on the basis of these classification, then the score, the share of positive sentences in a report as a measure for the performance. This is an overview of our findings or the results. So we have 9 international organizations in our data set, and I'm just looking, I can see UNICEF there as well. So we got the public evaluation reports of some of them from UNICEF here from only 2 years or 3 years, 2018-20. For some organizations, we have longer periods. If you want to know why, we can expand on that separately. And you can see here on the y-axis the variation in the positive sentences. So they go from 25% positive sentences to around 80% positive sentences. So this is our argument, is the expression of the performance in these reports. And to be sure, or to make sure and verify whether this is actually the case, we compared our algorithm, our sentence classification to reports that came with a performance score. We took them from the World Bank. So we ran an analysis on 600 reports from the World Bank with the performance scores. And we found that there's a really strong correlation between our own measure and the ranks, the school grades, basically, ranging from highly unsatisfactory to highly satisfactory that World Bank human coders provided to their reports. You can see this on the graph here. So the larger the share of positive sentences, the more positive is also the World Bank human coders assessment. Now, what can we do with that? We didn't expect a perfect correlation, right? But what we can do with this now is an interesting application for finding out why there is some variation. You can see that there are some outliers which are far away from our regression line here in the analysis. So we could in the future explore why is that the case? Why are there some reports with a lot of positive sentences but a poor grade, right? What is going on here? For us as academics, that's of course interesting, but I think it's also a good application as a quality assurance in evaluation. What we did, and just to give you another idea of applications, we correlated this with additional meta information on the reports here. For instance, we compared the share of positive sentences between reports that were published by the central evaluation unit in all these organizations, or reports that were commissioned by decentralized units somewhere else in the organization, mostly at the country level. And you can see here on the left side, the decentralized reports, on the right side, the centralized reports. You can see that the decentralized reports tend to be on average more positive than the centralized reports. So you can take your own conclusions from that, and it's obviously interesting then to go into the details. But I think my point becomes clear. This tool can be used as a quality assurance tool. So the data here were evaluation reports. The method is to extract quantitative performance scores, and this can be used for quality assurance. It can be used to explain performance across different reports. We are currently thinking about using other methods to find out, what were sort of good examples in the reports that are graded good, what were problematic aspects in reports that are graded less good. So you can run all kinds of additional analysis on the basis of this data, which was previously not possible because we just didn't know how positive or negative an evaluation actually was, apart from the few organizations that collect this data. Good, so this was the first application. The next application I think will be a bit faster. This is now also an application with known categories. So we knew what we were interested in. We applied dictionary methods in that case. So it was not a classification a task in the sense that you've just seen using machine learning, but here we built a dictionary that was supposed to capture something. And this something was the World Food Programme's peace building policy. Remember in 2013, or maybe you are aware of this, they published a peace building policy to link their activities more, or to be more aware in their activities about the conflict environment in which they are acting. I think for UNICEF, this is also something that's quite relevant. Recently, they got even the Nobel Peace Prize for their activities. But they also commissioned an evaluation, and I was part of that evaluation to figure out whether they have actually implemented that policy and what can be learned from that. The policy has two main components. One is that is about conflict awareness, raising that country offices should be more aware about the general conflict dynamics, and then they should improve their conflict-sensitive programming. These are the two main dimensions of the policy. Our research question for that evaluation basically was, to what extent do the annual country office reports, so all the country offices around the world send annual reports to headquarters, to what extent do they reflect these two main principles? And we used natural language processing to answer that question. Our data were 1,400 country operation annual reports from 92 countries between 2012 and 2020. And what we basically did is we built a dictionary that was supposed to capture the two phenomena. So is a country office aware of the conflict? There are a lot of conflict terminology in the reports. And do the reports reflect conflict-sensitive programming? Just an idea. So a dictionary basically works on the basis of individual terms and you count their frequency. So the first insight here is that the reports are not very strong in terms of the conflict-related language. There's, of course, as we would expect, food is the most frequent term in all these reports. Development, gender, humanitarian, and so on. These are the most frequent terms. Conflict, violence, peace, this terminology is much less frequent. This is not so surprising, but just to give you a bit of an idea of the scale. I'm not showing you the dictionaries. That's a bit too technical maybe, but then we counted the terms in our dictionaries to get an idea of how prevalent the two concepts have been over time. And you can see that they didn't really change, right? So the conflict awareness remains at the same level over time, and the conflict-sensitive programming has a little bit of a bump towards the end. So it improved a little bit, or it became more prevalent in the reports. So what can you do with that on top? You can look at the individual countries, and that's what you see here. We have the percentage of the terms here on the y-axis, and the x-axis has a GPI indicator, which is the conflict level of these countries. So we put in metadata to tell how prevalent is a conflict, or how intense is a conflict in a country. On the right side are the more intense countries, conflict countries. On the left side, the more peaceful countries. And you can see that there is some kind of a positive correlation. So in this case, conflict-sensitive programming is more prevalent in conflict countries, as it should be. But the more interesting thing is also that there are a couple of outlier countries. So these are probably countries that excelled in implementing this policy. And then it becomes interesting because our qualitative colleagues, they could go out and do case studies on these countries to come up with best practices and so on. Right, so I think this gives you another idea of how that can be used. You can use it to trace whether a policy has been implemented, and you can use it to identify interesting cases or examples from the data. Good, so the data here were country reports. We applied dictionary analysis. We used this in the context of an impact evaluation. Very good. So now we move to the other side of the branch. the unknown categories. And this is what Paul referred to a couple of times as topic modeling. So we applied that method as well. So in the more technical language, this is called mixed membership models. But what they actually do is they also count term frequencies, and from the sort of correlations in the term frequencies, they identify larger categories or topics in that case. This is an academic application now. The data that we used were the speeches in the United Nations Security Council. We did a case study on Afghanistan. For why we did that, maybe also on a separate page, but our research question here was which topics did dominate the debates in the UN Security Council, who spoke about which topics, and how did the debate change over time. So we have a lot of speech data. We have a data set with more than 80,000 speeches since 1995 in more than almost 6,000 meetings. So this is so much information no one can process. Now, we took all the data on Afghanistan. We did that because I personally had a lot of field experience from Afghanistan. So it's kind of a validation mindset, if you want. And we applied a method that's called structural topic modeling. So topic modeling method to identify, without knowing anything of the data, right? Without knowing anything, we applied the topic model algorithm to figure out what are the topics that are most prevalently discussed in what year. And you can illustrate the findings in various ways. This is a prevalence score for the time. So you have the different years here, and the colors represent the different topics. We have 13 topics in that case, so there's a kind of additional tools that help you establish the best number of topics in such data. And you can really nicely see how it changed over time from 2 topics before the military intervention in Afghanistan. Then you have this first green topic that is really the intervention discourse. You have the lighter green here that refers to presidential elections in the years when the elections took place. You have up there the EU contribution, which was discussed in the Security Council separately, and you have the responsibility shift, sort of the transfer of responsibilities to the Afghan government as the last topic, the pink one on the right side. So without knowing anything, we figured out with this method what was it that member states discussed in the council, and we could also say who spoke about what topic, and that's the second interesting aspect. And by knowing who spoke about what topic, we are able to construct what is called a topic speaker topic network. So the speaker topic network gives you all the speakers here represented as the countries and the topics they discussed, and you can see who spoke most intensively about a specific topic, right? And then in this case, this is from 1999. You can see there were mostly two topics, and different countries were kind of aligned to either of these 2 topics. This is the debate in, sorry, it's not 1999, it's actually 2014. And you see it's becoming more complex, more crowded, more people are talking, more topics have popped out in the meantime. Now, this is, of course, not an application that you will have in UNICEF. You're not working with speech data, but you can also imagine that this can be applied to when you aim to extract entities from text data. So imagine that you're interested in an evaluation about extracting which country office reports are talking about sustainable development goals. You can extract the sustainable development goals as topics, and you can kind of, with the metadata, come up with a map that looks similar. That's possible. So this topic modeling methods can be applied to various types of documents. Paul has mentioned it. They have applied it as well a couple of times. The method is topic modeling using topic networks for visualization purposes also. It can be used to map entities and specifically the relations between entities. That's quite important. It's important also to have a measure that maps the relation between entities. In our case, this is the link to a speech. So it really depends on the application how exactly that can be done. Good. I'm close to the 20 minutes. I'm going to draw the same conclusion that Paul, I think, also had at the end. I don't think that text mining is a replacement There will be very little of the work in evaluation that can be replaced on the basis of text mining, but it's a really helpful addition and sometimes can make analytical tasks much more efficient. It can also enable new answers on new analytical questions that we weren't able to answer before. But as I've shown you with the World Food Programme evaluation, that, by the way, is not yet published, so you got kind of a sneak preview here. But in that case, we were able to use our insights to steer the qualitative colleagues, right, who then went to do the country level analysis. So it's a really helpful addition, and probably sort of the intersection between the various methods is what's going to make the most out of these new methods. There's also not one best method. I've shown you a couple of applications. There are even more. Wordfish was mentioned and others. It really depends on the data, on the questions, on the objectives. And you have to make, I think it's always, you have an application, a research question, and then that is where you start thinking about what methods apply to that question best. Probably in a couple of years, maybe in 5 years, in 10 years, we will have a couple of standard applications that will be used over and over again. But for now, we are at the beginning of the process, so it's really a creative task to some extent. And then this is my key. I think I should have written down this in bold letters. Validation is always necessary, right? So when you do text analytical methods, it's always important to validate so that you are sure that in the end you're capturing the concepts and entities that you're interested in and not some random noise, because it will always give you results. It will always give you results. So you need to be sure that the results are valid. Good. With that, this nice view on our lake, and thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, both of you, Paul and Steffen. What an elucidating conversation on this particular data advancement. I'm particularly delighted to hear that there's some internal validity between both of your positions, that there's you guys are both endorsing the kinds of merits and benefits this type of application will have. We just have like 5 or 10 minutes. I'm going to open the floor to some questions. We already have one queued up. Edward, over to you for your question to the panelists.
Oops, sorry. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So thank you very much. It has been very, very interesting and thought-provoking, both Paul and Steffen. I think I sympathize very much with last of Steffen's point of validation, the need to validate. So just let me do a little bit of introduction here. I very much like all these models and all these ideas and all these applications, but I still have a little bit of a discomfort because I find them too inductive, And then I have a doubt always where are we doing well or not? So this is why I think validation is critical here. And I had a question here, mostly for it probably will be related to topic modeling or unsupervised models applied, and particularly for reduction of documents, of the amount of information that we manage, For example, for synthesis of evidence or of evaluations, like what Paul presented, the question is here, are we reducing well or not? I'm missing here something that tells us, I don't know, like what we were having in the traditional statistics, We were looking at type 1 errors or type 1-2 errors. Are we classifying well things or not? Are we excluding things that should never be excluded? Like one or two of those that, wow, that should have never been excluded, and the reverse, And not having that is what creates me a little bit this discomfort. So, but I'm not knowledgeable enough on these things. I would like to hear from you what you think. What would be your recommendations on this? Yeah, and anything that you can say on this, because definitely I'm going to start using these approaches, these techniques. But yeah, I would like to do it as well as possible. Over and thanks.
I don't know if you want to reply to that now, and we have another question, or let's take Tom Pellin's question, and then I'll open the floor to you to reply to both questions. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Ian. Great initiative. Thanks for organizing. Hi, Paul. Thanks, Steffen, both of you. quick question for Paul. I completely agree that it's really important to think carefully, how do these methods really help answering evaluation questions? Well, probably we haven't figured that out completely yet. You indicate, for example, effectiveness didn't help much, but you also indicated relevance. No, relevant question didn't help much. I was thinking a bit, maybe for the relevance question, there's something there. No, because if some of this sentiment analysis or analysis around what matters, what is important, would that be a proxy for understanding needs? Of course, matters is not the same as needs, but maybe it gives a little bit of a trends in the context of what matters, and it could help answering maybe relevance questions, so that an organization is then responsive to changing needs, changing to what matters. So first of all, I think you're completely right. We need to understand how this can be useful. But what do you think? Why did you say that it didn't help at all with relevance questions? That's my. Thank you.
Paul, Steffen, the floor is yours to respond.
Steffen, if you don't mind, I'll take this last question first, and perhaps, yeah, okay. Tom, nice to see you, and really good question. So, okay, I think what you just mentioned sounds really goes in the same direction as I think what we had in mind, or what I had in mind when I set the social media listening example that I gave. Could be helpful in the formative or design phase of an evaluation. So I think you're right that, for example, analyzing social media conversations in order to understand what is relevant, or analyzing some other texts that reveal preferences of, let's say, populations, of individuals that should be affected by an intervention or whatever, then I think NLP can really help you to do that. I mean, basically defining what is relevant, right? But then that was my point. Answering the question whether UNICEF, then did the right things to respond to that requires an additional analytical step, probably an additional analysis, data collection with key informant interviews, etc. But yes, it can help NLP to really define these questions around what is actually relevant, what matters, what is being discussed online. I mean, there's another question whether people reveal their actual preferences in conversations online or not, so there are, many layers to this. But I think what you refer to in order to sort of analyze text, in order to see what preferences or what is being said, basically, and then link that up with relevance, I think that is an interesting way forward. I agree. Yeah, but it's not it doesn't help you to then answer, okay, did we actually do what's relevant? That then relates to, I think something else. So that's my answer, I think, to this. Just one, sorry, and I'm going to say one thing about this type 1, type 2 error, and what are we missing, because it relates to social media listening. I think I just wanted to say that I think that is a really important question. Like, are we actually getting the right stuff when we're automatically sort of looking at text? And our experience in the social media listening part, which is slightly different from looking at a fixed corpus of documents where you know where they come from, is that it's very difficult to actually answer that. Like these big search machines like TalkWalker or Meltwater that can give you easy access to social media data are a bit iffy when it comes to how are you actually sampling your stuff? Like, how am I making actually sure that with my queries I'm getting the right stuff? And I think the validation point is very important there. Yeah, that is really, the whole, like, all the way around that, all you can do in a way is to randomly sample almost a set of tweets or newspaper articles or whatever you're getting, and looking at whether on average that looks fine, right? And looks like what you're trying to get. But it is very unstable. And in particular, these queries to search data from the internet are very unstable for small changes in your logical chain. And, and so I think that a lot more work needs to be done around sort of robustness of findings to these kind of things. Yeah, and having that in a systematic way. Yeah. Steffen, over to you. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't have much to add on that. what we shouldn't forget is that in statistical analysis, it's always also a question what is the quality of the data, right? So, I mean, this is here not a question of the analysis, but it's a question of the quality of the data, the input data that we use for the analysis. And this is the same problem for any kind of statistical analysis. You should be sure about the quality of your data. That's why I also emphasize the validation is important. In all of my applications that I mentioned, I gave a hint on how we started or how we went about the validations. I think there are also always ways how you can do that. That's why we did a case study on Afghanistan in the one case, which we could control before expanding to the whole corpus on the UN Security Council. That's why we did case studies on the countries that were outliers in the case of the WFP evaluation, which then also provided us with the feedback that we identified the correct countries and so on. So there are always validation techniques. And I think, if you ever read a text analytical paper that doesn't have a section on validation, explicit section on evaluation, then we should we should worry about it. But to some extent, I think the standards in the literature have not fully evolved yet or materialized yet.
Great, thank you both. I guess, one thing that's on a practical measure, I guess we understand that there are limitations to this type of technique, but it is a great advancement in trying to tackle the kinds of data that we're sitting on, but where we know that the potential is very great. I think some of the analysis that you have produced in your examples demonstrated in this webinar probably cannot stand alone, represent standalone data for our evaluations. I think it would be nice to see how it can carry a heavier tone and sort of our design, not just informative type understanding of where we should go as evaluators, but also like really serving as a strong data source within our menu of data options that we can use, because some of the findings that I've seen from your work is actually quite insightful. I don't know if it can replace key informant interviews. They should probably go in tandem. I think for the audience, we're going to close now, but we will certainly avail the presentations that you've both put together. Thank you both very much. It's extremely applied and practical and great. Where can, where would you advise evaluators to start if they wanted to start looking into this technique? Where should they who's producing some kind of evaluative guidance on this if people wanted to understand this further beyond the academic literature? Over. Steffen, maybe you go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm just wondering about an answer to that at the moment. I mean, we all met basically here through a conference, right? It's the book that I presented is from 2013. So in the social sciences, this has been applied for some time, but we're only now, after 10 years, getting into the practical applications. So there's a lot of work out in academics, but usually the interests of the academics are somehow different. Not all of that can be applied. So it's a process at the moment. I wouldn't give you a full answer where you can find these applications, or where there is not yet this kind of a directory to identify the method. At the moment, the best you can do is, Ian, to ask you probably. You have the overview of what's happening in the field, or you can also reach out to us. I would be happy to answer questions of that kind. My email address is on the slides. But as I said, at the moment we are talking about tailor-made solutions. You have a research objective, and then it's at the moment still tailor-made. There are no sort of out-of-the-shelf applications yet.
Yeah. Paula, go ahead, please.
I can see that there's a question, so I'm just going to say, be very brief. So, I mean, everything that Steffen just said. There's the American Evaluation Association conference is coming up in November. Actually, I'm going to be presenting there, and there are some very interesting talks there about that go in the same direction about NLP, but also about other data innovation related methods. So that's really interesting. And then the only other thing I wanted to mention is UN Global Pulse. Some of you might be familiar with that. They have published some sort of reports on the use of AI, ML, NLP as well in the context of evaluations that can then perhaps help you to find also further literature, right? So they are good sort of overview documents out there on this. I at least often look for, when someone asks me, I go to, you know, Global Pulse website and look around there. If they have published something, I find that quite helpful. Yeah, sorry, I can see that Ricardo has his hand up, I think.
Thanks, and thanks for the presentation. Actually, it's interesting you give this reference to Global Pulse, because back in the days at the European Evaluation Society, one of the keynotes was currently from the director of Global Pulse. And there was a whole shift into predictive analytics, which has then been taken up a lot by the private sector, but very little by the evaluation sector, which is very much reliant on traditional methods still. So it's quite interesting you have all this kind of analysis, but it seems very much in its infancy. And there are some examples, I think, especially in conflict-affected states, where there is a combination of the different methods that you were referring to in your presentation, Steffen. And it's not just around speech, but also on satellite imagery and stuff like that. And there's a lot of experimentation that some bilaterals have done. Now beyond these meta-analysis that you've done on the quality of the reports and the type of appreciation, you could even have a question around whether those evaluators are fully independent. And that could be a subjacent question that you could pose. And I think going purely in isolation on these type of methodologies without having, say, a quant background in isolation, without having a qual first in the scoping, is an error. So I think if you go back to Bamberger back in the days, based on an evaluation we did in 2010, there was an emergence of mixed method where you would have qual, quant, qual, and not the opposite, where there seems to be a prevalence of a lot of people that work in your field. So I think it's important to bridge the two perspectives, because otherwise it's very difficult to connect these schools of thought, I would say, and often evaluators then work in separate areas without bringing it to the next level. Over to you, so maybe you can have a few comments on this.
Yeah, so thanks a lot. I mean, I think I can agree with most of that. I don't know how far we should take that. Of course, for me personally, like on the kind of research philosophy that I would believe in, it's always relevant to sort of mix the different methods and not believe entirely in a kind of quantifying approach. There were colleagues, I think Natsios wrote this paper on the measurement disorder that he observed in international development, right, where everything needs to be quantified these days. We kind of are guilty of that ourselves in trying to quantify the information, the rich information that is contained in evaluation reports for our analytical questions. But there are two ends in a way. Either you have to deal with all these qualitative insights with all the text, and that's just to some extent there are limitations in the extent to which individuals can process all the data, or you accept certain trade-offs and try to move towards the other end while not forgetting where you're coming from. So I think that's the future, to bridge both sides and embark on the new opportunities that these more quantitative methods give you without discarding where we're coming from and why we are doing this, namely to improve how we are implementing policy or the mandates of international organizations on development, humanitarian assistance, and so on. So I think I'll keep it there. Thanks for that comment. I have a lot of sympathy for that.
Anything on your side, Paul, before we close?
No, I think Steffen answered
Okay.
in a way that I would probably also go in the same direction. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thank you.
Well, that's very convenient, and thank you both. I think we'll close the webinar now. I want to thank the participants for joining, and to our distinguished panelists for presenting their work. Please look out for our next month's webinar along the lines of this methodological learning series produced by the Evaluation Office. Thank you, everyone. Vielen Dank. And
thank you. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.